Välkommen allesammans! This channel is usually about Viking and Germanic history and religion, but I, for one, I'm old enough to remember what life was like when it wasn't cool to have Viking ancestry. Back in the 90s and 2000s, the Celtic culture was what it was all about. Everyone was Irish, or proud to be Irish, proud of the Celts, proud of the Picts, proud of Braveheart, bagpipes, gangs of New York, flogging Molly, all that stuff. And then a little TV show came around in 2010, and now all of a sudden no one cares about the Celts anymore. Everybody wants to be Viking. That just shows how quick fads change and how easily people are manipulated by the mainstream media. But for me, I really miss it, and I actually miss all the Celtic pride that used to be around. I think it is just as cool, if not even more so, a part of our heritage in the north of Europe. Really, the Celtic and Germanic peoples were not all that different at all. We are brothers of the north at the end of the day. So that's what this video is about, going over the oldest sources and archaeological finds to show you who the Celts really were and how closely related they were to the Germanic tribes that we all idolize here on this channel. So, very important, we can break down this history and the sources over many thousands of years. There's so much. The Celts are arguably the culture with the oldest roots, unifying them in all of Europe, and they spread out the furthest throughout the widest time period. Most of you watching, you're probably going to have a lot more Celtic DNA in you than Germanic, actually. Some places will have a lot more Celtic than others, of course, but most of Europe are going to have a little bit of Celtic in there. Even me, I'm about as Germanic as it gets, but even I have some Celtic ancestry as well, just because of how far they spread and how long of a time period, as I will show you in this map in just a minute. But the main focus of this video is going to center around a few hundred years where we consider the most important and influential time period for the Celts. So when examining any native culture, you have to do it before outside cultural influence came in on the wide scale, okay? So the Romans came in and conquered most of the Celtic areas right around 2,000 years ago, and then that watered down the native Celtic culture. Christianity did this even more so in the following 300-400 years after that. So to really get an idea of what original native Celtic culture was like, we have to look at the history before the Roman invasions and the Christianization to get a real idea there. So we're talking from basically right at about 2,000 years ago and before that. So problem is, we don't have many sources from that time. If we go back much before, about 500 BC, we have a grand total of 0 written sources about the Celts. We have to basically rely on the inscriptions and archaeological evidence from before that, which I am going to touch on to here. But what I'm going to do is primarily focus on the written sources about the Celts coming from about the year 100 BC until 200 AD-ish. But first, let's go to the oldest sources, and that's the archaeology. Archaeologically speaking, the term Celtic refers to peoples who are sharing a similar material culture and artistic style that are unified in the regions of Central Europe right here. Origins back to 3, even 4,000 years ago possibly, and then they spread out with time. But we are not 100% certain that all of these places shown here were in fact Celtic by religion and language. Like I said, there's not much written evidence. We just have to go on the similarities on the archaeology. But the actual word Celt, referring to a people, we don't see that come up until quite a bit later on in time, which I will speak about where that came from in a minute. The mainstream academic view is that the Celts and Proto-Celtic language arose out of the Urnfield culture of Central Europe about 1000 BC. So this is the area where they theorize is the original homelands of the Celts. Celtic language and culture, and they had a massive expansion after that following the next 600-700 years. This is the first real contact that we see that we can prove among the Germanic and the Celtic peoples. During the early to the mid-Bronze Age, we actually see an incredible amount of trade between Northern Europe, which is referred to as the cultural area of the Nordic Bronze Age, or whatever. There's a few different names for this culture here, but essentially it was the Nordic Bronze Age and would have been the Germanic tribes. We see traded artifacts going between there and Greece and into the Mediterranean at this time, but suddenly, at about 600 BC, the trade seems to have completely stopped for almost 500 years, and the theory is that the trade was blocked off by the Celts for whatever reason that may be. So that shows you how powerful the Celts must have been. This was peak Nordic Bronze Age culture, or maybe a little bit after that, where the best warrior culture that maybe ever existed was. But at some point, the Celts, they became the most powerful. They took complete control of all Central Europe, and then they spread out from as far as they wanted to go, really. So much that trade didn't even pass through their areas unless they allowed it. By the 6th century BC, the Celtic peoples we can see then in all these different places were recognizable through their shared culture and their art, and theoretically their common language as well, which we do have evidence of in archaeological finds was spoken in most of these areas. The earliest confirmed examples of the Celtic language are the Leptonic inscriptions from the 6th century BC. And we find recognizable inscriptions of this style of Celtic language all around Europe, all the way up until the 4th century AD in the Ogham inscriptions, which most of you may have heard of. But of course, this Proto-Celtic language was much older than all of this. So all of these areas here, they would have had a Celtic language most likely. We just don't have enough information to know exactly what that language was like. The only surviving Celtic languages that we have today are actually in the British Isles, but every single one of these places here would have had various dialects of this Proto-Celtic language. So this is long before we have any evidence of any Germanic language. The earliest runic inscriptions are dated to the 1st century. Of course, both the Germanic and Celtic languages would be much older than this, but at least we can say we have archaeological evidence that the written Celtic language is probably much older than the Germanic written language. That's all for the archaeology for this video. Let's get into some ancient sources. What did cultures think about the Celts? What did they write down about the Celts? Well, the oldest ones are going to be the Greek sources. The first recorded use of the name Celt was Keltoi, as it's referred to in ancient Greek, and that was by Greek geographer Hecataeus of Miletus in 517 BC. And that was when he wrote about a people living near modern-day Marseille, so France. In the 5th century BC, a bit later on, Greek writer Herodotus referred to the Keltoi as living around the source of the Danube and in the far west of Europe. And that agrees with the archaeological evidence showing this area being the original home of the Celts as well. The etymology of Keltoi, what the Greeks called them, that's uncertain. We don't know. We know later on in history that the Celts called themselves a similar word. But possible Proto-Indo-European roots could be this, to kill, to hide, or it could be related to modern Welsh and modern Irish words. Some scholars suggest that this etymology goes back to meaning people of the descendants of the hidden one. This is also etymologically related to the Old Norse word Hel, so the underworld and the underworld goddess. And according to Julius Caesar, he actually said that the Celtic Gauls claimed descent from an underworld god. So there's one similarity there between the Vikings that we have sources there and the Celts. I'll cover all of that in the next video about the Celtic religion, because that's what I'm most interested in, so stay tuned for that one. Later on, in 391 BC, Celts who had their homes beyond the Alps streamed through the passes in great size and seized territory, as you can see in this source here. Later on, Greek geographer Strabo wrote about Gaul towards the end of the 1st century BC, and he referred to them there as the race which is now called both Gallic and Galactic, and that there were Celtic peoples in Iberia too, so the Spanish peninsula. So there you go. At the time, we're talking right about 2,000 years ago, the Celts were migrating and conquering everywhere, just like the Germanic tribes did about, 700, depending on what time period we're looking at. It's the migration period, so about 300 to 400, 500 AD. So their heyday was basically 700 years after the Celtic tribes' heyday and massive expansion. But let's fast forward in history to where the best sources come from, and this is ancient Rome. This was ancient Rome. This was Rome's heyday in history. This is when they were expanding. This is about 100 BC to 200 AD, something like that. In the 1st century, Julius Caesar wrote that the Gauls called themselves Celts, or the Celtae in their own tongue. And this is probably the most detailed source, by the way, Julius Caesar's written work, the Gallic Wars of 58 to 51 BC. Important note, though, it was only the Gauls who were referred to as Celts in all the Roman sources, and they were living in modern-day France, what it is now. So, of course, we know the people of Britain, they were Celts as well at the time. We just don't have any written sources calling them Celts. Writers from the time referred to the people of the British Isles as Britons, Bretone in Greek, or Britanni in Latin, but of course they were Celts. We know this. Even Roman historian Tacitus, he says that the Britons resembled the Gauls in customs and religion, just as the Germanic tribes were unified by language too, by language, custom, and religion. But that's about the only thing that unified them, because they were all tribes constantly at war. The Germanic tribes and the Celts would have been exactly the same at this time period before the Romans came in and conquered them. So, what were the Celts like? This is the most important part. And how do they compare to the Germanic tribes of the same time? We're talking, again, right around 2,000 years ago and the centuries around that. First, we need to get this subject out of the way, because a lot of people get it completely wrong and they're talking about it everywhere. A lot of people consider the Celts to be somehow inferior to the Germanic tribes when it comes to warfare and physical capabilities and the war spirit. So yeah, it's true, the Romans conquered almost all of the Celtic lands relatively easy, according to a lot of the history sources. While the Romans, they tried to conquer the Germanic lands too, but they were very unsuccessful. They barely made it into Germanic tribal areas. So yeah, that's true. They conquered the Celts a lot easier than they did the Germanic peoples, but that was largely due to the nature and surrounding habitat. The Germanic areas were heavily swamped and forested, and there were thousands of tribes. They were spread out everywhere, all secluded, and it was very hard for the Roman legions to march in there and bully a smaller, less capable force like they did everywhere else. So Gaul and Britain and the other Celtic lands, they were a lot more open, and the people there were a lot more civilized than the Germanic tribes, according to Roman sources. That's the only reasons that the Romans were able to conquer the Celts a lot easier. It wasn't because the Celts were weaker or inferior in battle at all, so people need to stop believing that. I hate to see that online. Truth is that the Romans greatly respected the Celtic war culture, so much that they even took parts of Celtic warfare and they adopted it in the Roman army. They were most impressed by the heavy cavalry. The Celts were great on horses, which the Germanic tribes and even the Romans didn't use very much. We also see the Roman army adapting Celtic saddles, Celtic cavalry tactics, and even other things like Celtic helmets, swords, the spasa and the epona, and even the Celtic horse goddess. Also, armor, decorating themselves with animal furs to make them look ferocious. The Romans took this all from the Celts, apparently. We have many sources describing the Celts fighting ferociously like wild beasts too, like you can see here. And check out this quote from Greek writer Dionysius. There you can see, the Celts were not wimps. They were very, very tough people. And here we have another source, and this is where that comes from, this famous notion that the Celts fought naked. And they probably did, and they were probably absolutely beasts. So don't think of the Celts as any less warlike than the Germanic tribes at all. They were both amazing warriors. Next, what did the Celts look like? Very important. So according to Diodorus, they were looking like a badass young Hulk Hogan with the slick back hair and the handlebar mustache. Matter of fact, I even did my hair a little bit like this video. Maybe I didn't have to shave the sides like this, but the slick back hair as much as they could, but still keeping it long like that. Also, Diodorus says during the later Iron Age, the Gauls generally wore long sleeve shirts and tunics, long trousers, and a lot of these were even checkered. So even the Gauls did this, like the Scottish tartans from later on in time would be. I used a little AI to generate some images here based on this description of the Celts. So they would have looked something like this. They would not have looked that different from the Germanic peoples at all. They would have had same skin tone, same physical stature, just as big and strong, same hair and eye color. The only difference in appearance between the Celts and the Germanic peoples would have been, the clothing, hairstyle. Maybe there would be a little bit more ginger people, some more red hair in the Celtic world. But other than that, Celtic and Germanic people would have looked like brothers. Next big question, were the Celts a country or state? Were they unified as one land or one people? So no, the Celts definitely didn't think of themselves as one people and one state. They were definitely more tribal, and as the Romans noticed as well, they referred to them all as Celts or Gauls or Britons, but they were definitely not unified countries. However, they were much more unified than the Germanic tribes were, and more civilized too, actually, with their politics, as numerous Roman authors had pointed out. The Celts had pretty big cities, fortresses, and political organization. The Germanic tribes were exactly the opposite. They were tribes living in the woods, relatively unorganized, who united sometimes to fight off the Romans. The Celts, they were tribal too. Tacitus states that the Celts were a population scattered and barbarous and therefore inclined to war. And Julius Caesar supports this by writing that the Gauls waged war on the Germanic tribes offensively. So they fought the Germanic peoples too. So yeah, same thing. Celts were tribal just like the Germanic people, but they were a bit more unified and definitely had more developed infrastructure in the towns and fortresses. Very important. Speaking about societal classes, Celtic society was essentially based in a caste system, and at the top of this caste system were the Druids and the warrior class. This is supported by Caesar, who informs us this as well. Also, Caesar wrote about how Druids took supreme authority over all priests, but the knights, or as translated more commonly, the warrior class, they were also just as high ranking as the Druids, but they still had to follow the Druids' guidelines. Even chieftains and kings, they were not permitted to do or plan anything without the assistance and blessing of these Druids. Below the Druid and warrior social class would have been the freemen and freewomen, and they were the bulk of society, and they lived under the protection of the local chieftain or leader, and they were expected to fight for him as well. Below them, in the bottom third class, was the slave class. This was servants, or it was slaves, or it was hostages or prisoners, or there were criminals who had lost their rights as well. So basically, you could lose all your rights if you had been a bad criminal. Exactly the same as you would in the Norse world. This would be called being an outlaw. So you would have no protection under the law or rights, but in the Norse world you wouldn't be forced into slavery like the Celts would force you to do, but pretty much every aspect of this social hierarchy and the three classes was the same among the Celts and the Germanic peoples. Only small difference is that the Germanic peoples didn't seem to grant their religious leaders so much power like the Celts granted the Druids. Germanic cultures, I think they definitely had something similar to Druids, both in the Germanic tribal era and in the Viking Age too, the Gothies, but they were not anywhere near as powerful and influential as the Celtic Druids. So it shows that the Celts were a very spiritual people and cared about those things. I can do a whole nother video just on the Druids. Let's talk about women in society. So it seems like women had more power in the Celtic world than in the Germanic world, and they had way more power than women would have had in the Roman world. Roman historians here mentioned Celtic women could incite, participate, and even lead battles. Plutarch wrote that the Celtic women acted as ambassadors to avoid a war among Celtic chiefdoms. Even one source mentions a queen ruling over the Celts, and her name was Boudicca. Celtic girls were also permitted to study under Druids, so they were allowed to learn these spiritual traditions and knowledge as well. But definitely in the sources, all the Druids were for sure men. So the title and power that the Druids had, that was definitely reserved for the men, but the actual skills and knowledge and respect, that could be had by the women too. So it's not the feminist matriarchy that some people make Celtic society out to be, though. As you can see here, Caesar wrote that the husbands still had the power of life and death over their wives, as well as the children. So here too in the Celtic world, just like in the Germanic tribal world, Celtic women had power, they had rights, they were respected, and they were valued even to the point that they would be consulted and they would help give guidance to the men. Much more than in the Roman world. So Germanic and Celtic societies, their women had much more rights than anywhere else in the world, pretty much all the way up until today. This is still the way it is today. Celtic and Germanic societies value their women and give them much more power. But make no mistake, it was still a man's world back in the old days. So that is what the sources say about that. We can speak a little bit about marriage too. One thing interesting about the Celts is that polygamy is found in many sources, and there's a lot more open sexuality, it seems, from the sources about the Celts as well. Cassius Dio wrote that there was sexual freedom among women in Celtic Britain, when a Celtic wife was basically making fun of a Roman woman, saying, yes, in Britain we get to pick the best men to be within the open, whereas you Roman women are forced to be with the most vile men in secret. And I think that's a beautiful thing about the Celtic society. A sign of a decaying society is when the most beautiful women, highest status women, get so shallow and materialistic, and they have so little power in society that they are forced to end up with the most vile men just for wealth and comfort. Which society do we live in these days? I wonder. You guys let me know. So this is one aspect where the Germanic peoples were quite different to the Celts. The Germanic peoples were very strictly monogamous, as we have multiple sources for. So Celtic women, they were maybe a bit more skanky than the Germanic women. It's going out and sleeping with the men they want out in the open, but they still had a great society where they had their choice of men which to be with, unlike Rome and unlike pretty much everywhere else in the world where women didn't have any choices or rights. So to finish off the video, we gotta speak about this, the gayness. This has sparked so much anger and debate and online fighting. Yes, it's true, we have not just one, not two, but we have many sources saying that homosexuality was not only accepted, but even preferred among the Celtic men. Greek philosopher Aristotle, in one of the oldest sources about the Celts, wrote in his Politics that the Celts of southeastern Europe approved of male homosexuality. Greek historian Diodorus wrote that although Gaulish women were very beautiful, the men had little to do with them, and it was a custom for men to sleep on animal skins with two younger males. He further claimed that the young men would offer themselves to strangers, and it was a great insult if the offer was refused. and his claim was later repeated by Greco-Roman writers as well. Julius Caesar also said that the men preferred to sleep with each other. So that's it. The main debate against these sources, that this was Roman propaganda, and that wasn't really true. That was just something that the Romans said about the Celts to make them look bad. And what was in fact really going on that the Romans didn't understand, that there were traditional warrior bonding rituals with absolutely no sexual aspect to it. They would maybe have these bonding rituals that required abstinence from women at certain times, just like many other cultures did in the world, and the Romans misinterpreted this to basically be gay sex. So we don't know. Guys, believe what you want. I'm not here to say that, just bring you the sources. But what we can say, okay, this doesn't necessarily mean that all Celts were gay from the sources, like a lot of people want to say. Celts expanded through vast territories over thousands of years. So maybe the sources, as it suggests, maybe it was just the Gauls that was gay, but maybe the Britons or the other Celtic peoples weren't. Who knows? Believe whatever you want, just bring to the sources and what scholars have interpreted it before. One thing we do have to say, though, is that none of this happened in the Germanic world. We have a grand total of 0 attestations of any same-sex relationship among any native Germanic pagan peoples before Christianity came in. And this is all the way, from 2,000 years ago until 1,000 years later during the Viking Age. We have absolutely no evidence of that homosexuality was approved or tolerated, and we have sources and many laws going throughout this 1,000 years as well that prohibited same-sex relations in the Germanic tribal eras too. I did a full video on that you can see those sources here if you'd like. So yeah, well, up to you. You can believe whatever you want. These are just the sources, but yeah, that would, if we are to believe those, it's up to you. And if the sources are true, that would be really the biggest and main difference between the Celtic and Germanic cultures. As you have seen by now, the Celts and the Germanic peoples were far more similar than different. They really were brother cultures. I argue that there are no closer cultures in the Indo-European family than the Germanic peoples and the Celts. And that's why I will be doing a lot more videos on this, because especially with the religion, I believe we can see each other's sources and read them and fill in the blanks and really figure out the lost beliefs and religion and traditions of our people. So that's it for this video. It was a long one. Let me know down below in the comments which subjects you would like to see more about the Celts comparing the Germanic peoples. But yeah, that's all I have to say for today. Vi ses nästa gång.